In this training, we're going to cover essential thumbnail advice, the truth about clickbait, best practices, strategies, and tips for making effective thumbnails, how I make my thumbnails and stand out, tips for improving your thumbnails, how to get ideas for your thumbnails, should you make your own thumbnails, the reality of branded thumbnails, and case studies of thumbnails that worked and others that didn't, along with my thought process behind them. Basically, this should be your definitive guide for thumbnails. And once you pair this training with the training on titles, you'll have everything you need to start getting way more clicks on your videos. But let's start with some essential thumbnail advice. The thumbnail is one of the most important factors of a video's success. Significantly more people will see your thumbnail than your actual video, so you absolutely should be spending a disproportionate amount of time thinking about the thumbnail. One of the most valuable pieces of advice I can give you is to spend way more time on your thumbnails. People are willing to spend countless hours on filming and editing, and yet barely spend an hour on the thumbnail concept and design. Not just that, since thumbnails can be changed after the video is posted, split testing multiple thumbnails to test which performs better is one of the highest ROI activities you can do on your channel. Thumbnails are relatively quick to make, and you can make unlimited thumbnail changes. And if you're wondering if it's actually worth going back and changing thumbnails on old videos, the answer is definitely yes. It really can make a difference. Not because the act of actually changing the thumbnail makes a direct difference, but because a different thumbnail may cause more people to click. And if YouTube's algorithms see an increase in people wanting to watch this video, it's more likely to push the video to a wider audience. But there is a lot of conflicting advice about thumbnails, because depending on the video, niche, audience, and context, what makes a good thumbnail could be quite different. There is no one-size-fits-all. The best thumbnail is the one that gets more of your target audience to click, but this is going to vary. So let's state some things that are fundamentally true for everyone. A thumbnail's goal is to grab attention and get people to click, which means to catch the audience's eye and stand out amongst the other thumbnails being displayed on screen at the same time that are also competing for their attention. The ultimate test: is this a thumbnail I can't scroll past without going, damn, I need to know what's inside that video? Which brings us to a slightly controversial topic: ethical clickbait. When people hear the word clickbait, they normally have very negative associations, like being tricked to click on something, but then it wasn't actually what was claimed. However, let's be brutally honest here. We absolutely are trying to bait people into clicking. Thumbnail design is all about making our thumbnail as clickable as possible and framing our video to be as enticing for the viewer to click on as we possibly can. So in a sense, we do need to bait people into clicking by creating curiosity, intrigue, and making big claims. But the key is, we then need to actually deliver. We're not trying to trick or lie to people, because actually that would hurt retention if we promise one thing in the thumbnail and then don't deliver, and it'd hurt our reputation in the long run. But we are thinking, what's the most interesting way we can show this idea or concept? Because it's not just about having a good video idea, it's about packaging it in the right way. We want to really hype things up and make them sound as exciting as possible, as we don't want your great videos to go to waste because the thumbnail isn't very clickable. We want something that makes people think, I have to click that right now. As long as viewers come away satisfied with the video and don't feel cheated, using clickbaity techniques is just part of the game with YouTube. As if you don't, somebody else will, and they'll get the click instead. It's a fight for attention, and your thumbnail is quite literally competing against all the other thumbnails on screen at the same time. That's why it's important to look at it compared to other thumbnails to see if your thumbnail stands out when compared to these other images. So, it's only bad clickbait if the thumbnail promises something that doesn't deliver. Now let's talk about best practices. Number one is to make it pop, and this is largely going to come from vibrance and contrast. People don't analyze all the thumbnail options on screen when they're deciding to click. They're usually either scrolling through their feed or watching another video, and then a thumbnail catches their eye. They only look at it for a second or two and instinctively make a decision. So of course the goal is always going to be to make the most eye-catching thumbnail. Generally speaking, bright colors with heavy contrast and high vibrance help the thumbnail pop. Here's my ridiculous secret to improving thumbnails. Open Photoshop, increase the vibrance and contrast settings. Seriously, I guarantee if you do this with most thumbnails, it will stand out more. Literally just take one of your thumbnails, increase the vibrance and contrast, and see how it looks. Now personally, I like to go over the top with this more than most, simply because I think it catches attention more. So quite often when a designer sends me version 1 of a thumbnail, I'll tell them to make all the colors brighter, bolder, and more vibrant. Here is one of my most extreme examples with the JP Morgan video. Now, you might be thinking from a design perspective, too much color doesn't look as good. But remember, the point of the thumbnail is to stand out amongst all the other options, or interrupt the viewer from scrolling. It's not a beauty contest, and one of these is definitely more eye-catching and noticeable. If your thumbnail doesn't know what make it pop means, I've linked to a video underneath this training, which I think will be really helpful. Other simple Photoshop features like adding drop shadow and stroke also makes images and text pop more as well. This point about making it pop explains why one of the most popular YouTube thumbnail backgrounds is the blue sky and green grass. They are such bright, vivid colors, and as cliche as it has now become, it does catch attention. MrBeast thumbnails are excellent at this, and a great reference for making thumbnails pop. When it comes to thumbnails, the next thing you want to think about is curiosity. Create intrigue. In other words, make people curious to find out more or find out the answer to something. For example, I've seen people make thumbnails about how much money they earned last year, but don't give away the answer in the title and thumbnail. That removes the need to click the video to find out. Adding a little mystery and deliberately making people want to know more is a good way of enticing people to click on your video. We want to create an open loop in their brain where they need to click to find out the answer or the solution or what the thumbnail or title actually means, as opposed to making everything perfectly clear from the title and thumbnail. Now, one important caveat to this, you don't want to completely confuse them so they have zero clue what the video's about, but you do want to give them a reason why they need to click right now. Think to yourself, what question are people going to ask when they see this thumbnail? Here's an example here, with the world's fastest camera drone versus an F1 car. Clearly, there's a huge amount of curiosity here to find out which wins. Or this example here, why are there 96 million black balls on this reservoir? Again, this is excellent packaging, as it gets you so intrigued you feel you need to click to find out. Another lesson I've learned the hard way is that most of the time, less is more, and you want to have less text and less clutter. Simplicity and clarity should be a priority. This often means just having less elements within a thumbnail. Many beginner thumbnails are just way too crowded, so as a result, nothing stands out. There's too much noise and distraction, so it doesn't catch the eye. Simpler thumbnails with only minimal or even no text also generally work better. That's because if you have too much text, it becomes too small to read clearly. Remember, thumbnails are often viewed at a small size in the sidebar or on mobile. Generally, 1 or 2 words of text is enough, and often no words at all are needed in the thumbnail, as the title explains the video and the thumbnail can just use images. The majority of my thumbnails nowadays have no text, and they perform much better. That's because it's usually better to show, not tell. So consider how you can use images more than text to get your point across, like using an action shot. If you go on Fiverr and type in thumbnail, you'll see a lot of the thumbnails suffer from this problem of clutter and too much text. There's just way too much going on, so it doesn't look clean. The font should also be very clear and easy to read at a glance, and larger text is normally better too, as it stands out more. You also don't want the words to be confusing. Try to make it easily understandable without any thinking. So just really clear, shorter words like, start doing this. Generally, you want to convey one simple idea so it's easier to process quickly. MrBeast gave an example of how having just one Lamborghini on one of his thumbnails was more intuitive to understand than having 6 Lamborghinis. So even though 6 Lambos may sound cooler, our brain can't process it well enough in the second we spend looking at the thumbnail. So actually, just one bigger, clearer image worked way better. People are looking at the thumbnail so quickly, we want them to digest the idea more easily. And so generally, less elements is better, but make them bigger and clearer. The key is to keep it simple, but still professional looking. There's a difference between basic and low effort, versus simple and less elements, but still looking good. So honestly, one of the biggest hacks with thumbnails is being a bit more minimalist. Cut unnecessary details from your thumbnails. In fact, many of the best thumbnails have no more than 3 elements. Here's some examples, each with many millions of views, but relatively simple, uncluttered, and a small number of elements. Next up is color theory. The colors you use on your thumbnail can make a big difference. Opposite sides of the color wheel complement each other well, as it creates a strong contrast which helps them stand out more. For example, green and red are opposite each other, so they'll contrast well. I recommend watching this short video on the basics of color theory and how using the color wheel can help you find the right colors to put together. So this will be linked underneath this video training. But the simplest lesson here is that high contrast colors help elements stand out more. For example, if you were having text on your thumbnail, you wouldn't want its color to be too similar to the background behind it. That's why yellow and black work really well, or red and white, very high contrast. Sometimes simply swapping the colors can make a thumbnail much more attention grabbing. For example, if you're using an image of someone and they're wearing a dull grey t-shirt, ask your thumbnail designer to change the color to a much bolder color, like bright red or purple. It's going to stand out way more. I'll even sometimes change the color of someone's eyes to make them more noticeable. Remember, the goal is to catch attention, and color will definitely help you do that. Another important lesson for thumbnails is faces. YouTube has done research that found thumbnails with faces often do particularly well. But don't have a whole body shot from far away. It should be a close-up. Probably more close-up than your initial instincts would be. Just zooming in more on the face and head can often improve click-through rates. Another key point with this is that you don't want to have too many faces. One is normally best, or two at most, and generally more expressive faces work better. Something that I also think is crucial but often missed is that it needs to be a very high definition, sharp image. Lower quality images with poor lighting make a thumbnail look much less professional, which subconsciously communicates the video is lower quality too. A good thumbnail designer will be able to Photoshop the image to make it look better if you ask them. So that'll be improving the lighting and smoothing the image a little bit, etc. But if you're starting with an image that isn't very crisp and high quality, it'll just never look quite right. This makes such a huge difference. Here's the exact same guy from the image above, but using a lower quality image with worse lighting, and also zoomed out too much as well. Look at the view count difference. 3.4 million views versus 11,000 views. Exact same guy, but a big difference in the thumbnails. Now let's get to one of my favorite strategies when it comes to thumbnails, fame jacking. If people don't know you, your face is not going to be very effective at getting people to click. People are much more drawn towards people that they already recognize and know. So it can be very beneficial to include the faces of famous celebrities or recognizable characters in your thumbnails, and basically hijack their fame. Because if you talk about them briefly in your video, or if your video is somewhat related to them, you can include them in your thumbnail. The whole video doesn't have to be about them. For example, if you're making a fitness documentary, using a ripped photo of Arnold Schwarzenegger is probably going to work a lot better than using a photo of yourself. In a sea of thumbnails, well-known faces really draw attention, and people often go to what's familiar. You also appeal to people not only interested in the topic, but interested in that celebrity. The same principle applies for utilizing creators or brand logos. Things people recognize are always going to stand out to them. That's why branding is so powerful, but you can use this to your advantage. One example of a channel that utilized this strategy very effectively is Charisma on Command. Initially, one of the channel creators had his own face in the thumbnails, but then they started using relevant celebrities and characters instead. For example, using Don Draper from Mad Men for a thumbnail about confidence and respect. No wonder that got more views when people associate him with that, and he's such a recognizable face, compared to the channel creator whose face isn't as recognizable. So, consider whose fame you can tap into to help get more clicks on your thumbnail. Another thumbnail lesson is that it should be complementary to the title. Typically, someone notices the thumbnail first, then they read the title, and if both of those combined create enough curiosity or interest, they click. But this means the thumbnail and title work together in tandem. They are reliant on each other, and so it's important to consider them together as the packaging and not just decide on your title and thumbnail separately. It's all about how they work together. A lot of people just repeat the same idea in the title in the thumbnail, but generally it's better if the thumbnail and title can both add something new rather than just repeating each other. So always think of the titles and thumbnails together as a package. Do they go well together and complement each other, and are they congruent? You can even take this a step further, where the thumbnail and title literally play off each other, like this. Move here to survive a nuclear war. These are the asteroids to worry about, and there's a red arrow pointing to them. Or the title, this is not yellow, and then just a yellow thumbnail. Either way, make sure that your thumbnail and title are working well together. Another really big lesson for thumbnails is to test on different devices and get feedback. When designing thumbnails, many people look at them at full size, but when they're actually shown on YouTube, they're often much smaller, which changes our perception of them. Make sure you use these different thumbnail preview sites to get an idea of how it'll look on different parts of YouTube. So there's thumbsup.tv, clickpilot.app, and wouldyu.click. For example, if most of your audience is on mobile, you need to consider which design works best on mobile. It's also worth testing the thumbnail on both light and dark mode. I did a poll and found the majority of my audience actually use dark mode on YouTube, which means thumbnails on a white background stand out a lot more than a dark background. You can also use Google Vision to analyze thumbnail images. Remember, the most important thing is trying to come up with the thumbnail that gets the most clicks. People are often scrolling passively, they're not closely analyzing each thumbnail. So one tip that has worked well for me is using a tool like ClickPilot, or even just taking a screenshot of my YouTube homepage and adding in my thumbnail in one of the squares. Then I close my eyes and see where my eyes are first drawn to. Which thumbnail do your eyes gravitate towards? Because that's the ultimate test of which ones are catching attention best. I also recommend getting feedback from others, but the question to ask them is not which thumbnail looks best, it's which would you click on? Initially, I made the mistake of asking friends who knew nothing about YouTube, and they would generally pick the nicest looking thumbnail, which isn't always the one that captures attention best. So having a network of YouTubers who understand thumbnail psychology better would be very helpful, so you can all share your thumbnails and get feedback and ideas. Having a second opinion can help you see things differently. And when it comes to these best practices for thumbnails, one final tip is to test a lot and then double down on what works. It's easy to get stuck on one design idea and then just make little tweaks to it, but actually sometimes you need a totally different concept. Think, how could I show this in a completely different way? As there are so many different ways to visualize the same thing, like focusing on a very different aspect of the story or video. However, once you have a thumbnail that seems to be working really well and the video is getting a lot more views than normal, that's the point where it's good to double down on what's working and repeat that format for your other videos. Many people make the mistake of trying to switch things up too much and their thumbnails have zero consistency. If you have a formula that's working, you don't need to keep changing it all the time. Repeat what's working with little tweaks to match each video. For example, with my channel, the pool of money at the bottom of my thumbnails is used a lot because I found for my channel it works really well. You don't need to reinvent the wheel every time. Another thing I found is that because YouTube videos will start autoplaying when you hover over them, it can be useful to think of the first few seconds of the video as an extended thumbnail. Make sure those first few frames of the intro are as visually interesting as possible, and ideally somewhat related to the thumbnail. For example, my Rockefeller video went viral, but the intro scene was actually quite similar to the image in the thumbnail, of a big close-up face of Rockefeller. This is an example of finding a pattern that works, and then when you do, double down on it. But here's where things get really interesting with thumbnails. Sometimes you need to break the rules and defy expectations. If every thumbnail follows all of those best practices and principles we just talked about, suddenly that doesn't stand out quite as much. And actually, the total opposite, like a badly drawn paint thumbnail, ironically does stand out more. Does the success of these videos mean we should all start making cluttered paint thumbnails? No. It means that by having a good thumbnail often means defying expectations and being different to others. By definition, that is standing out. For example, if I uploaded a video with a completely black thumbnail, it might actually get a lot of clicks, as people will be wondering what's going on. It'd definitely be unexpected, and it would stand out by being so different. And it's such a departure from my normal content, so it would create intrigue. But if I did that every video, it wouldn't. So anti-thumbnails that don't follow the best practices can work. This is partially because of a concept called banner blindness, which is where people see the same thing so often they stop noticing it as much. When everyone's doing X, Y feels fresh. However, sticking with the best practices that work well the majority of the time is normally a pretty safe and reliable starting point. Personally, I don't like focusing on outliers, I prefer focusing on patterns that work well consistently. For example, there will be some videos that blow up where it's just a still frame from the video and not even using a custom thumbnail. Will that occasionally work? Of course. Is that the norm? No. Follow patterns more than occasional outliers. You have a much higher chance of success by following what works most often. But do be aware that there are exceptions to every rule, and don't be afraid to experiment even if it goes against what most other people are doing. Thumbnail library and how to come up with thumbnail ideas. One of the biggest cheat codes to consistently coming up with successful thumbnails is to keep a thumbnail library, a folder of thumbnails that catch your eye. Whenever you see one, add it to the folder. That way, when you come to make thumbnails, you have so much inspiration to draw from, and you can mix and match elements from these other thumbnails that have worked well. However, don't just limit yourself to YouTube, look at streaming sites too. Platforms like Netflix split test their thumbnails, so pay attention when a thumbnail stands out to you, as maybe you can take elements of that for your YouTube thumbnails. As well as finding other YouTube creators with thumbnails you like, there's also a few good collections here. There's Thumbnail Colors on Twitter, there's thumbnails101.com, there's 1of10 Media, which posts good thumbnails they find, and there's thumbnail.world/breakdowns, which also has some good thumbnails. But as well as building a library of thumbnail images and screenshots that you like, you can also build a library of assets to use in your future thumbnails, like certain backgrounds that work particularly well or images. For example, since I know what videos I have coming up that are in production, I'll try to be on the lookout for anything related to that whilst the video is being made. To find assets, you can use Google tools like filtering by HD or transparent images. You just click the Tools button on Google Image Search. But the point with all of this is, don't just use YouTube as a consumer. Pay attention when something stops you scrolling and makes you click. What about that thumbnail hooked you? Try to analyze why and keep a folder of your favorites so you always have inspiration to draw from when designing your own thumbnails. Now let's talk about branded thumbnails. Should you use the exact same thumbnail format for every video? Consistency has its benefits. People instantly know which channel the thumbnail is from, but I think for most creators this limits them too much. For podcasts it can work, but for videos where each one is different, I think it's too restrictive. I also think having your logo on the thumbnail is a waste of space most of the time, especially if your logo isn't really well known and you don't have a brand people already love. For the majority of people, especially when starting out and trying to reach a wide mass audience, I think each video should have a different thumbnail. This allows for more experimentation to see what works, and it means every thumbnail is fully tailored to that video, as opposed to arbitrarily trying to fit everything into the exact same format every time, because a lot of the people finding the video won't have even seen your other videos anyway. However, I do think it's good to have some elements that are similar and consistent in your thumbnails. For example, if you look at mine, they're almost always very vibrant and colourful, quite intense, often a singular central subject, like a photo of someone close up in the middle. They also often quite have an AI 3D image, and yet despite looking at all of these and seeing similarities, they are very different and each one fits the specific video. So I prefer to think of it as having a rough thumbnail style rather than a constrictive format that has to be the same every time. Should you make thumbnails yourself? Unless you have a lot of design experience, I definitely think it's best to hire a designer for the thumbnail. But you should still be heavily involved in the idea behind the thumbnail, as most designers aren't necessarily good at understanding what makes a highly clickable thumbnail. Remember, a good thumbnail is more about human psychology than just a nice design. But the designer can execute the idea you give them better than you can, and it's relatively low cost for something with huge return on investment. If you really want to design it yourself, or you don't have the budget for a designer, there are free tools like Canva.com, or of course there are more advanced tools like Photoshop. However, I do just want to point out, you can hire a designer for $10 or less, so for most people, you will have the budget for this. Under this training though, I'll leave a thumbnail design tutorial from a thumbnail designer I've worked with before, and a guide on actually making thumbnails, along with some other references. I'll also link to a PSD file from one of my past thumbnails, so you can see the different layers and how it was made in Photoshop. But again, for most people, just get a thumbnail designer. You want it to look professional, as low quality thumbnails generally subconsciously imply a low quality video. However, do spend more time thinking about the thumbnail. For many creators, thumbnails are often an afterthought once they've made the video, but they should be a priority, and they should be considered even before going ahead with the video at all. We'll talk about hiring a lot more later in the course, but for thumbnails specifically, I found Fiverr thumbnails generally aren't that good. You'll tend to find better designers who specifically understand YouTube over on Twitter, or X, whatever we're going to call it now. You can search for thumbnail designers, and once you find a few you like, that'll lead you down a rabbit hole where you'll find even more. Ideally, you'll find a couple of designers to work with, so every video you can have multiple different options for the thumbnail. I do think it's worthwhile building up a relationship with the same small group of thumbnail designers once you've found some that you like, because that way you can get on the exact same page as they fully understand what you're aiming for. The more you work with them, the better it should get. Now, in the algorithm training of this course, we covered the process of split testing different thumbnails to see which performs better. And if you are serious about becoming a big creator, there is literally no excuse for only making one thumbnail for a video. You need multiple thumbnails so you can test what works rather than just going on your own gut feeling. I keep saying this, but thumbnails are one of the highest leverage activities on YouTube, meaning that they require relatively small amounts of time and money to make, and yet they have a disproportionately huge impact on your video's success. I know I'm repeating that, but it seriously is key. So, once you have some thumbnail options, don't forget to split test. Now, it's all well and good looking at the theory behind thumbnails, but let's actually look at it in practice. I think it's really valuable to see some case studies and the thought process behind them. We'll start with the evolution of this Lego thumbnail. I knew I wanted Lego bricks included in the thumbnail as they're easily recognizable and very bright colors. I also knew we needed text to signify this wasn't a kid's video, so something like the truth or the dark truth. So this was design one we came up with. But looking at this, it just felt a bit boring still. It's a guy in a pool of Lego bricks. So I considered what interesting elements of the story could be incorporated. And so in the Lego story, multiple times their factory burns down. Fire is obviously quite dramatic and attention grabbing, and so then the thumbnail became this. You can see the bricks still stayed the same, but now with this fire, the vibe of the thumbnail has changed from just a guy in Lego bricks to clearly something going horribly wrong with the fire, and so it matches the dark truth text a lot better. It's also just more visually interesting and attention grabbing. And so we've still got the same original concept essentially, we're just expanding on it. We also made the text smaller so you could actually read the text, as on the previous one it technically said the arc truth because some of the text was covered. Also, the black background we added, compared to the grey background, added much more contrast with the bricks and the fire. But even though I like this new concept, there was one big problem in my opinion. Nobody knows who this guy is. He's taking up prime real estate, but not giving people any reason to click. The problem is the main characters in the Lego story, like the Lego founder and the Lego CEO, they're just not recognizable faces to most people. It's not like a video on Apple where a Steve Jobs image would work well. So then I thought, what do people associate with Lego? Which led me to this. We kept most things the same again, like the red hat that contrasted nicely with the background and the recognizable Lego logo, but by changing the person in the middle, it felt much more fitting. The Lego character is actually much more recognizable than the Lego CEO or the Lego founder. However, recently I decided to make a couple of extra little tweaks as a test. I figured the word "the" wasn't adding anything of value, and yet it was taking up a lot of space. So by removing the word "the", we can have the text saying dark truth be bigger and clearer, and make sure the text isn't covered at all like it was in previous versions. I also pulled my regular trick of increasing the contrast and vibrance a little, just so the colors stand out as much as possible. Remember, this isn't a design competition, it's about catching someone's eye. And so this is the current version right now, and maybe more changes will happen in future, but in my opinion this is way better than the first one. Much more recognizable, more interesting, more colourful, same concept, but continual evolution, keeping what works, changing what didn't. Now, out of interest, we did try some totally different concepts for the video too, as sometimes the concept itself is the problem and you need a total change. So for example, we tried this. And honestly, I do kinda like this, as it certainly nicely contrasts with the yellow and black. I also like the minimalist approach, which can often work better than busy thumbnails, and it also conveys emotion, so it's doing some things right. But personally, I think the one I actually went for is more interesting and looks higher quality, and like more effort has gone into it. But this could have been a good backup option. And it was actually from designing this one that the idea to use the Lego figure in the other thumbnail came about. So sometimes you can mix and match elements you like from different thumbnails and combine them together to create the best version overall. There was one more design too. With more tweaks, this one could obviously be improved further, but this one felt a bit too kid-like for me. I felt for the actual content of the video, the one I ended up using fit much better. But you can see how it does take trial and error and experimentation to get one you're happy with. So I hope this case study was helpful for understanding my thought process behind the changes. And you also see how important it is to question the purpose of all the elements in a thumbnail. Do I need to use this specific image or this specific text? Everything should be there for a reason. Analyze every element and figure out what might need to be changed. Even when you're happy with a thumbnail, go one step further and always ask, but how could we make it even better? Keep doing that until there's nothing you can think of to improve. Now let's look at the evolution of my Nest Egg thumbnail and the importance of a quality high definition photo and testing. So here was version 1. Something about the shadows on the face just didn't work well to me. The lighting was off, and the face just didn't stand out enough. It wasn't high quality enough either. And you see this a lot on YouTube. The thumbnail image just doesn't look like it belongs in the thumbnail. It's clearly just a photoshopped image stuck on top of a background. We want the thumbnail elements to feel integrated, like they actually all fit together. So then I found this face. This face is much higher quality, without the dark shadows. It pops more. When you put these thumbnails side by side, you'll notice this face a lot more. We kept the other elements though, as the red arrow pointing to the small vial definitely creates curiosity to find out what it is. It's also important to note that the face above is heavily edited. Here is the original image. The thing is, we didn't want a model. We wanted a nurse who looked like she'd gone through some dark stuff. So I simply asked the thumbnail designer to add cuts and marks to her face. And just as a side note, this could actually be a useful tip for you to find more model type photos and then just edit them to suit your needs, because the model photos are going to be such higher quality images. But still, something wasn't quite right, so I tested a bunch of different backgrounds. This one with the blood was definitely eye-catching, but it was a lot of red. And so I tried this. This thumbnail worked much better because the dark black background contrasts much better with the other elements. It makes everything stand out more. The red arrow, the face, the yellow bottle, all of them are much clearer when set against the black background. Adding the skulls just further communicated to the mystery, evil vibe I was aiming for. So a lot of the elements of this thumbnail we ended up using are the same as the original, but just compare them. If I'd gone with that first thumbnail the designer sent, I am very confident the video would not have done anywhere near as well. This is why you have to push back on the designer's first attempt. Consider what's working and what isn't, and try different variations. It's always worth it. Because this thumbnail here ended up getting millions of views. Of course, with all these case studies, you may prefer some of the earlier versions, but I went for what I felt would stand out most and maximize clicks. But ultimately, thumbnails are subjective, which is why utilizing data to make decisions is key, which means split testing which ones actually get more views. Next up is a case study on my Domino's video about totally reframing the packaging. I want to show you an example of completely changing the packaging for a video. I have a video on the story of Domino's Pizza, and initially I went for this, the homeless orphan who built Domino's, and the focus in the thumbnail is clearly on this orphan boy. Now, I liked this a lot personally, but the video did not perform as well as expected. So we instead completely reframed the video to this, the insane story of Domino's Pizza, and the focus became on the pizza slice. And this video now has well over 1.6 million views. This is why sometimes you can't just think of little tweaks, you need to totally repackage what the video is. It went from an underdog story about this orphan building Domino's to the mysterious truth about why Domino's became so big. Both packaging options fit the video, but one of them performed better for my audience. In hindsight, I think the first one was probably a bit too busy. There's a lot going on, and the more minimalist focused approach does tend to pop more. The vibrant blue and red Domino's colors also contrast more on the second option and fit Domino's branding better. Not just that, but the pizza slice also makes more sense for a video about Domino's as well. I also think there's just more mystery and intrigue with the second option, which may explain why more people clicked. I still like the first one, but this is why split testing is crucial, and not being afraid to consider a completely different angle. It can totally transform the trajectory of the video. So that was an example of how a big total change to the packaging can really help. But I also want to stress that little details can make a big difference too. Initially, the thumbnail for my Burger King video was going to be this. But then I made a last minute change and asked my thumbnail designer to change the burger filling to cash instead. This achieved a few things. Number one, the cash is more fitting to the content and theme of the channel, which is business or money, whereas the first thumbnail doesn't communicate business or money in any way. It could be a Burger King review, for example, so the cash connects it to the theme more. Number two, a burger stuffed with cash is much more visually interesting. A photo of a burger with normal fillings is kind of boring, as it's something we've all seen many times before. It's not going to grab our attention much. Whereas you probably haven't seen many burgers filled with cash. It's more unique and attention grabbing. And number three, it creates a bit more intrigue. Whereas if it was just a normal burger, everyone clearly knows Burger King is associated with burgers. There's not much curiosity there, but a burger stuffed with cash might subconsciously ask a few more questions. So it's a fairly subtle change. The rest of the thumbnail is the same, but this one element makes a difference. And this is why even when you have a thumbnail design you like, it's worth asking, but could we make it even better? And keep repeating that until you can't think of anything else. Some experiments won't work, but it's always worth trying. Another example of a small detail but a big impact was with my WhatsApp video. The first option just feels a little too plain. I was racking my brain what could make this more interesting, but without feeling cluttered. And so we decided to add the red notification symbol, something our brains are very drawn to because we all get that dopamine hit from new notifications. And then adding the lock hinted at what the betrayal might be, but without making it super obvious. I also want to make a quick point on why I used the word betrayal in the thumbnail. The title of this video is How WhatsApp Makes Money. So if I had just done the obvious thing and had the WhatsApp logo with money, there's no extra implication. It's just literally how WhatsApp makes money. I'm sure some people are interested, but it's not really a must click. Whereas the WhatsApp betrayal signifies in the thumbnail there's some controversy here. This isn't just a simple, oh, they make money from ads. Something's going on here. There's a story here. It asks more questions. What is this betrayal? To me personally, that creates so much more intrigue and a much stronger feeling of, okay, I need to find out what this is all about right now, so I'm going to click the video. So the wording you use can make a big difference and create those curiosity gaps. And as a final case study, let's look at improvement on another channel. I just wanted to highlight a totally different channel unrelated to mine, which is Hamza, who switched up his thumbnail style to something much more engaging. He went from just using YouTube's auto thumbnail feature, like this, to these thumbnails that look like so much more effort went into the video. Personally, I am much more drawn to these thumbnails, which you'll notice utilize many of the techniques we've covered in this training. But again, with thumbnails, the key is finding what works best for you and your audience. Of course, thumbnails are just half the story when it comes to getting the click. Now we need to talk about titles. So I'll see you in the next training.